Hey guys, Lavoie here. Welcome to episode 6 of the King of Kings. We are looking at kings through this mural. We are going to continue why mankind thinks he needs a king. This is part 3. In our last episode, we looked at the divine right of a king. And one of the reasons why mankind thinks he needs a king is he needs somebody that's in charge that can speak on behalf of God to them. Now, these kings, they're not even a supreme monarch. They still have to answer to the popes. Now, this is part of their king playbook that they've set up, is that you have to be in line with the bloodline of King Charlemagne. And the reason why they picked King Charlemagne is because King Charlemagne somehow seemingly was anointed by the popes to be the divine right of the divine authority, whatever you want to call it, over his people. And so everybody from that point on lines themselves up with the bloodline of Charlemagne. And I kid you not, they really did. And they thought their blood was special. And dude, you need your blood. Your blood isn't that much more special than the next person. The problem with this is it causes a lot of racism and classism. And so, I mean, that's why you have all these different caste systems in Europe at that time, is because somehow you were like a distant cousin of the king and you're like this noble aristocrat, and the peasants didn't have this blood, but you did. And so the caste system, starts to become a big problem in Europe. We also find out that that in that playbook you had to be male to be a king. And so in France, there was a 100-year war, and if you watch the last episode, the whole war ended up being resolved with Joan of Arc. And Joan of Arc is kind of like a messenger from God coming down saying, hey, listen, it doesn't have to be a male. It could be, a female. It could be whoever. This king is the king, right? So talk about dysfunctional families. We are going to look at one of the biggest dysfunctional families there is. Now for our little story. It's Britain, and the year is 1489. The king is King Henry VII. Now, King Henry VII wants to be more of a superpower, because you got to understand, Britain at the time only had, they didn't even have 1 million people living in Britain. There wasn't lots. And the country that had the most, that had a large number of people living was Spain. And Spain was a superpower in Europe. And so the King of England figured he'd create an alliance with the King of Spain. Now, in Spain were two very powerful monarchs. There was Queen Isabella, who came from her own kingdom, and then there's King Ferdinand, who came from a smaller kingdom, which became Spain. This is how Spain became this big, powerful country. And they had lots of money and lots of influence. In fact, they paid for the Pope's Inquisition. This was, something where they would torture all the Protestants, and it cost money. I mean, to build the rack and these thumb screws. I mean, all this stuff costs money to build these Inquisition centers. So they had money and influence with the popes. King Henry VII figured, what would be really good for Britain would be for us to create this alliance. And so they signed a treaty. And they also shared a common enemy, and that enemy was France. And France at the time, they were aligning themselves with the Ottoman Empire, and they're doing all kinds of other things. And so Spain figured, what would be great is if we can get Britain on board and we can all keep an eye on France. Now, during this treaty, King Henry VII decides to throw in this extra little clause that his son would marry their daughter. And there was this enormous dowry that she had. She had like a $20 million dowry. This was a sweet, sweet deal for the King of England. He was going to have influence with the King of Spain, who controlled the popes. And whoever controlled the popes controlled basically all of Europe. They were going to marry their son Arthur to Princess Catherine. And there was one problem, they're only 13 years old at the time. And they had to wait until they were 15 years old. So when Arthur turned 15, he was actually, for a young man, he was very excited. He would write back and forth to the princess, Catherine, And apparently his Latin was really bad because she spoke Spanish and he spoke English, and they'd have to write this Latin thing between each other. And his Latin was terrible. And so the Queen of Spain says, to her daughter, you better learn English because this guy won't be able to talk to you very well in Latin. Nevertheless, he turns 15, and they send the princess over there for him to marry her. And they have this wonderful, wedding, apparently. Lots of stuff at the wedding, and it was great. Anyways, as they're on their way to the castle that they're now going to be living in, they both get sick. And it's kind of a funny thing. They said an ominous vapor came into the room, and they both breathed it in, and they got sick. And she recovered from this sickness. But the young Prince Arthur, dies. And it's a terrible thing. So this is terrible stuff for the king. He's devastated. To make matters worse, the relationship between Britain and Spain start to deteriorate. And the princess's mother, Queen Isabella of Spain, dies at this time. And so the poor princess has no place to go. She ends up staying in England this whole time. And Arthur had a younger brother, Henry. And so Henry was kind of like the party animal brother. And he was never trained in being a king. He he enjoyed jousting. Jousting, like really? Like they actually did that? Anyways, I'm sure he enjoyed the jesters in the court. Those stories where you hear of a big, rich, successful family. They have like big businesses, and there's two sons. One son's kind of like the playboy son who's just enjoying all the wealth of the family, and then you got the older son who's responsible. He's gonna take over the family business. But when the older son dies, the younger son it all lands on his shoulders that he has to take over the business. And so it's that kind of thing. So Henry has to take over the throne now that his brother's dead, and he's not trained at all. The king ends up dying, and so young Henry VIII is the succession to the throne. And what's interesting about this whole story, and we are going to kind of conclude things really soon here and continue on in our next episode, but all of this stuff, the people back then, they all saw this as providence, God's providence. Like somehow things happen for a reason. And there's a reason why this guy was going to be the next king, King Henry VIII, an untrained king man. And he ends up doing something which is against the king rule book, which is you don't marry your brother's wife. But he does. He does. He goes against the wishes of the church and everything, and he marries Catherine, and he takes her on as his wife. Now, nobody really knows the reason why. There's a lot of debate around this. But we are going to look into this, the reason why he marries her, and what happens next. Because this is one of those changes on the earth that affects everything all around the world, what happens next. So we're going to conclude here with the fact that all of this stuff was looked at as divine providence, and these kings are insisting that their blood has some kind of value, and they need to keep it in the family all the time. The most dysfunctional families in the world seem to be these kings. So we're gonna learn some more stuff in the next episode. Thank you very much. I'm Lavoie. Stay tuned for King of Kings.